Mark, thank you so much for joining us, especially amid such a busy news cycle. We've probably missed about 10 news alerts today, but really appreciate it. So you came to the Times about 6 years ago. You were very much an outsider. You had come from the BBC, so British nonprofit broadcasting, and here you are, legacy print organization.
Yeah, quite a few people said to me from one not-for-profit to another sort of thing.
But we're going to
not true, not true.
You've changed that, which we will get into. So what was your mandate when you arrived?
Well, it's an interesting question. And the other thing about me was, I guess people here will know that particularly in the US tradition, there's a very strong tradition of separation of so-called church and state. Church meaning newsroom journalism and state meaning the kind of, in quotes, business side, ad sales and all the rest of it. And the other thing was I'd really spent my entire career on the church side. I'd never really been involved. I mean, I'd with the BBC, which I ran before, and Channel 4 both had commercial divisions, but essentially they were not for profit. And my whole background was in content, in being a journalist, and then commissioning TV shows and all the rest of it. So, well, I think that what the board of the Times wanted was a bit more energy around the transition to digital.
Right.
And they felt that I'd shown, particularly at the BBC, that I could do that in the context of a very powerful kind of legacy brand. And they wanted also something around international and great American news brand becoming a more international brand. I guess those are the reasons, rightly or wrongly, they thought I might be okay.
Well, so far, so good. I mean, one of the things that you've done very successfully is you've helped transition the paper, not just the paper, the property, away from being driven by advertising to the subscription model. And now I think you definitely have, you were about 80% advertising at one point. Now you're down to about 20.
Yeah.
So what are the implications of that? How does that change the type of product you put out?
Well, the thing, I felt, I first started reading the Times when I had done a year in the early 1980s in New York, and really came across the Times. I'd heard about it much earlier, during Watergate, when I was kind of like a young teenager, 13, 14. I heard about the epic journalistic battle between the Times and the Washington Post for the Pentagon Papers, and I really kind of became a journalist, even though I couldn't read those titles and that kind of the romance of that. And unbelievably, here we are, kind of 40 years later, 40 years plus later. And it's the same titles right now.
That was not supposed to happen, right? It was supposed to be the digital, the BuzzFeeds, the Vox.
Complete. And I would, when I first arrived, I'd be invited to, on occasions like this, they'd have a panel. They'd have, like Jonah Peretti from BuzzFeed and Shane Smith or Shane from Vice, and they'd have me on as a kind of, token dinosaur. It's like, these are the old guys, they're doing their best, but they're never going to make it, sort of thing. And actually, that's changed over the last 5 or 6 years. That I don't see those guys quite so much. We tend to get invited on our own. Exactly, we're still here. But look, what I thought was, and what we liked what we saw with the digital subscription model, and we thought we could grow it. We still believe that. But to me, part of it is that the Times, to me, in its kind of golden age, I always think you find the future in the past if you look hard enough, that it had a relationship with its users. The regular readers, the subscribers of the physical New York Times, they got their job through the Times. They got their apartment through the Times. They figured out what to cook through the Times, which Broadway show to see. And that sense of a complete relationship, a kind of indispensability in a household's life, the conversation in the evening, you had to have read a certain columnist in the Times, and our puzzle was, could you recreate that in digital? And if you could recreate it and get the kind of engagement which goes with a really loyal audience and a deep level of engagement, time spent, value, I felt we could figure out the monetization. I mean, it's almost like, the current thesis is subscription, and that feels pretty good to us. And by the way, it's a very valuable audience. If you've got a really engaged, thoughtful audience, you can also actually make a better fist of digital advertising as a secondary revenue stream than you can if you try and just go head-to-head with Google and Facebook with kind of volume digital display advertising, because those guys are going to win.
Right.
So it's actually, I think it's a better, this relationship, deep engagement model is actually a better model for advertising as well. But it's almost like what really matters to me is can we build up this body of people who really, kind of feel close to us and feel engaged with us. People sometimes say, oh, you mean they really trust you? And I kind of want to say, I think our guys are quite critical people. They're quite, they think about the news. There'll be things that we do that they love, things that we do that they like, some stuff they probably detest.
Right.
And it's quite a kind of lively, a relationship, a kind of human relationship is quite a dynamic, lively thing. And I think that's kind of what we want, what we've always had at our best with our readers, and that's what we want in the future.
So let's talk about some of the ways that you've done that. I mean, obviously people are coming to you for your great journalism. Yeah. But last quarter, about 50% of your digital subscriptions also came because of crosswords and cooking.
Yeah.
So is that the secret sauce? A nation full of wannabe chefs and puzzlers. Sure,
but also, the heritage. So the first recipes appear in the Times, I think in the 1850s, certainly by the 1860s and 70s, you've got readers writing in with recipes. And crosswords, not as old as that, but they're early, kind of early to mid 20th century. And they both, in their different ways, Times recipes, I like cooking, and I use quite a lot of our recipes.
I heard a story that this was maybe a little bit your idea. You said, we should do cooking.
I was involved in the UK in the 90s in a kind of reinvention of food TV, much of which ended up either coming to America or being copied here. And I think food is very interesting as a kind of way into lifestyle and culture and history. And Anthony Bourdain, for example, showed how much you can do and how you can use food as a kind of MacGuffin to get into all sorts of different things about human culture. So I think it's a very rich area. But the thing about the Times and the Times recipes is they work. They like everything else, it's done with kind of fanatical persnicketiness and sort of exactness and, tested 20 times sort of thing. And so it works. And I think that, those are two examples of how we can bring part of a expectation of the Times brand about accuracy and about thoughtfulness and sort of timeliness and apply it to quite different things. And the crosswords, obviously, with that whole business of they get harder every day of the week, it all speaks to the kind of person who is our kind of person. And to me, things like that, and in some ways, I'd say the podcast we launched,
the Daily,
the Daily.
Let's just say, who here listens to the Daily? Okay.
I would say it's one of those things. Be careful about listening to it, because if you do start listening to it, you probably won't stop. It's a very addictive thing. And I'd say the Daily's like this. So this is an attempt by us to recreate these other touch points that, as I said, we lost. Help wanted is not the way most people get there in the New York Times. Is not the way people get their jobs generally now. If you want the kind of scary comparison, I think 2005, I want to say, help wanted classified job ads in the physical New York Times, probably $235 million of revenue at a probably 95% gross margin. This year, maybe, 6 or 7 million. Okay. 6 or 7 million. The Times has remained profitable throughout this, but sometimes you hear numbers like that and you think it's a miracle. So some stuff you're going to lose, and there's just a reality of confronting the fact that stuff is gone, and maybe something different could have been done 20 years ago and it wouldn't have gone, but it wasn't. It's gone. It's never coming back. How can you find these other broader touch points to broaden the relationship and to do what the Times has always done, which is that, be superlative at certain core kinds of, national news, international news, opinion, culture, things like books and theatre, movies and music have always been very central. But how can you spread beyond that? So you're adding more value, you're building that relationship, you're reaching beyond your heartland somewhat younger demographics and moving geographically away from your heartland to more broadly across America and the world. How can you do all of that? And then, whereas I felt everyone I talked to, particularly, legacy media, particularly legacy print media, was obsessing about finer points of monetization and sort of what kind of advertising or what kind of subscription. In a way, I want to say it's all about the user experience and it's all about engagement. If you can figure that out and you can get the actual experience people have with you to be really superlative, I think the issues of the kind of the tactics of how you turn that into money are second order issues, which you can figure those out.
Great. I'm going to come to questions in a minute, but I first want to ask you about Trump. So he's perpetuated the concept of fake news, that the press is the enemy of the people, that you're the failing New York Times. But you've also called out the appointment of the special counsel and the firing of James Comey as driving readership. So is Trump good or bad for business?
By the way, what's interesting about, I think one of the things that's interesting about the president is actually, if you look very closely, he didn't invent fake news. Fake news began as something of a moral panic on the left in the immediate aftermath of the election, and the feeling that one of the ways in which the election of Donald Trump might not be legitimate was because of the use, as it were, by forces supporting Trump of fake news, and he very adroitly turned that right round and used the label fake news to talk about what he would regard as establishment media, the Times, but not just the Times, CNN, Washington Post, and others, at the kind of establishment media, and which is in his sort of demonology is very closely connected to the deep state and all sorts of other terrible things. So it's a very clever use of language. Well, look, I mean, what I want to say is that an intense news cycle has always historically kind of sold newspapers and made TV news shows ratings go up, and I think what we're seeing is conforms to that kind of traditional thing. I think that in a moment when people have been very worried about the provenance of news, can I believe this? Do I know where it's come from? I think that helps traditional brands, and I think as a matter of record, the Times has done a good job in covering the Trump presidency so far with lots of original journalism and breakthrough moments in journalism. But I want to say, I think in many ways the most influential story we've done in the last 2 years in the Trump era has been Me Too.
Right.
Which had, I mean, you can argue there's a sort of subterranean connection to some of the allegations made about Trump himself, but essentially that's an independent, separate story. And I think the conversation sparked by that story shows the clout the New York Times can have away from straightforward journalism and away, in a sense, from the classic left-right ideological kind of siege war that America and other Western countries are going through. And that was I think, a very interesting example of us pointing at something which is about gender, it's about women and specifically work and the work environment. And although other stories like the Bill O'Reilly and Harvey Weinstein stories have been done, these ones felt different, and it was partly to do with the depth and quality of the reporting by the New York Times. And it must be said also by the New Yorker, by Ronan Farrow, the New Yorker did some excellent work as well.
Great. Do we have any? We've got a question right up here. Thanks, Adam.
Mark, Adam Lashinsky with Fortune. Thank you for being here. Looking backward, the crossword puzzles and recipes seem so obvious, seem like such an obviously smart move. It appears that you've stopped there, though. So, yeah. So what's next?
Well, I want to say we've got a few more things we're working on. Heritage is not the only potential kind of touchstone for this. We bought the website Wirecutter, which is a consumer testing website. Now, it's kind of interesting. Why did we buy it? Well, the first thing is our newsroom wanted us to buy it. They were already licensing Wirecutter content. They thought that Wirecutter's approach was original and brilliant, and in terms of its quality, stood up to the rather fearsome standards of that newsroom. And I felt that their enthusiasm and the fact that we looked at, you always look, could we build something like that quickly? And we thought probably not, actually. And so that was another example. We are exploring something about parenting. We've done a lot of content over the years. It's never been put in one place, but in various parts of the Times, we've done a great deal on parenting, and we think that the choices and the issues and the questions that parents of different, or parents of children of different ages face with everything from kind of, issues of diet and health to issues of, electronic entertainment and the rest of it. That's a very fertile area for us, so we're looking at that. But to me, if you think about, in a sense, the classic, Sunday physical New York Times, where, you'll get arm ache carrying it, certainly in this time of year, and which is full of all sorts of different, kinds of lifestyle coverage and different content areas. There's a very rich, I think, vein for us to pursue in thinking of, things which feel right to us and which in some way we can bring something special to, and which when we talk to our users, they understand why we're doing them. We don't want to do anything. It's about, I think of a little solar system with news and opinion as very much the kind of star, but with planets as well.
I think we've got a question back there. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Warren Falkowitz. There seems to be an increase in anonymous reporting and anonymous op-ed. I wonder if you could speak to what anonymous reporting does for trust with your readers.
Sure. So I mean,
will you tell us who wrote the op-ed?
That was my last question.
The rules on how the Times uses anonymous sources have not changed. And there are particular circumstances, particularly when people are in a context where they feel if they were identified as sources, they would be at physical danger or they would lose their livelihood, where the editors of the Times, both in news and also in opinion, might consider using anonymous sources. But with very strict conditions about the numbers of sources, the satisfaction you have that the source is the real thing, that you really are talking to a real person, you're hearing from a real person, a higher standard in terms of literally the number of sources you want, and fairly careful explanations to the reader about why you've elected to use anonymous sources. And if you look at both news stories, but if you also look at the paragraph at the start of the kind of preamble to the essay by Anonymous about I am part of the resistance, you'll see us trying to contextualize it like that. To state the obvious, it is always preferable in journalism if your sources can be named. This is around accountability, and again, that issue of provenance. However, I want to say that I believe that there are many millions of users. We have about 140 million users a month, by the way. There are many millions of users who understand that the New York Times is not a flighty journalistic organization. It thinks incredibly carefully about trying to the accuracy and the authenticity of what it publishes, and that if a given piece of work, be it an essay in the opinion department or a news story, relies in part or in total on anonymous sources, that the editors have satisfied themselves that it's legitimate. I want to say that in the context of the anonymous "I'm part of the resistance" essay, the reaction to it, certainly for the first 24 hours, was entirely predicated on the fact that it was authentic, and it was an act of treason, to use the president's word, by someone in his administration. The idea that it might be in some way faked or invented came up several days later. Everyone as it were, who was unhappy about it was unhappy not because it was inauthentic, but because it was authentic. One point, the White House was saying they'd narrowed it down to a dozen suspects, which is, tells you this is something they're taking very seriously. They think of it as a leak inquiry, not as a piece of fantasy, which I think goes to the fact that if it's in the New York Times, most people will start with the presumption is that we've tried very, very carefully to make sure it's true.